Okay, so even though there's a bunch of people missing, we're going to get started anyway today with exercise 108. And this one's a little bit different than a lot of the lectures in this class where I start first with the lecture and then we go into the demo part. Today I'm actually going to start with the demo part and we're gonna focus on that. I've found that while this is a little bit early in your skill set to start throwing this at you, generally if we throw this kind of an exercise at you early, you start to think more about how do you integrate scenes together. And so we'll do a lot more of this later on in the semester where there'll be more to it and you'll have a building and you'll be integrating it and then you'll throw a person in and whatever. So today we're just isolating the idea of I have a scene and somehow I have to take an object that's not in that scene and put it into that scene and make it look like it belongs as part of the scene. And so when I go through the example, I'll show you the kinds of things that tend to happen when it doesn't look like it belongs and then how to make it look like it belongs. So as part of exercise 108, obviously this is the text that you guys get on your little handout today. But at the very bottom, I also have some links with some city street examples and some landscape examples. You don't have to pick from these lists. Actually, some of the landscape ones I don't think are the best. But I'm also trying to make it easy enough for you guys to get in so you don't waste all of your class period looking for a particular scene. When you're looking for a scene, we're looking for something that is relatively empty, so there aren't people in it. It's harder to integrate a person into a scene that has a bunch of people already in it. But we're also looking for something with some telltale lighting conditions. So as I look at this one, you can see that the shadow is about halfway from these buildings into the alley, but there's definitely a sunny patch. So we'll have to work with that sunny patch. As I go through, here's a few other examples. This one has the same thing where there's a little bit of a shadow there. This one is probably not the best one to pick because there's a little bit too much shadow on the ground. You're not going to see the shadow of the person as easy. So I might not do that one. This one's pretty good. Not the most attractive picture by any means, but gives you a nice blank piece of asphalt to try to put a person in. So that's not a bad strategy. We're going to start first with the city example. So in a city street, putting a person in on something that's flat and a paved surface is a lot easier. So we're going to start with that, but I will eventually get to where we don't have it. This will probably be the example I use. I tend to use this every year because it has some complexities to it, and it's a good one to kind of walk through what those complexities are. Another example here, this one would work just fine, trying to put somebody into this scene as well. If you want to pick your own city street, by all means do it. You'll find, though, that when you're searching that there's an awful lot of streets that you might find or landscapes that you might find that the sky's overcast and you don't have strong shadows. For today's purposes, we want to have strong shadows because it'll teach you more about the process. When we get to the landscape images, I pulled up some other landscape images here. Again, I'm looking for kind of strong telltale shadows in the scene. That'll help us figure it out. I'm going to use this one a little bit later on just as an example of how the shadows are cast. This one I just found, and I think it's a pretty good one because we have a good sense of where the shadow is. So I may end up using this one, even though I haven't done that one before, as my example. So anyway, we'll get to the landscape scene a little bit later on, but we're going to start with the city scene. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the file in Photoshop. I've already downloaded it, so I shouldn't have to wait for it to download. Let me open up Photoshop to start here. And then I'll go to File and then Open. And we'll go into today's exercise. And let me see, where's the scene? There's the scene that I was talking about. So before we actually insert anything into the scene, I want you to take some time and actually look at the scene carefully and start to analyze what's happening in the scene, where's the light coming from, etc. So I'm going to walk you through my analysis process. You'll need to do it on your own image, on your own, obviously. And when we start to look at this, a couple things come to mind. First off, and I'm going to draw on top of this for right now, just so that you guys can see the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So bear with me while I change and give myself a little red line here so that we can talk. Okay, a couple things. In this particular scene, everything is vanishing to a point that's somewhere here in the scene. So if I were to draw a line along this curb, for example, it's pointing roughly to that section. If I drew a line along this curb right here, it's roughly pointing to that point. If I connected all of these lights together, they're roughly pointing to that same general area. The tops of the buildings are all roughly pointing in that same general area. So this center here is what's called the vanishing point. And some of you guys took 130, so you had a little bit of experience with constructing perspectives, maybe. They don't always teach it. Is it 131? 130 doesn't teach it? Okay. 131 then. You may have a little experience thinking through perspectives. I want to introduce you a bit to that concept because even though we're not actually drawing the perspective, we still need to be aware of some of the concepts. So this is called a one-point perspective. Essentially, all of the lines in the scene are vanishing to a single point way out here in space. As I start to look at that, what comes to where all these points meet is something called a horizon line. And so if you were to stand, the easiest way of thinking about this is, let's say you stand on the beach with your feet in the water and you look out toward the, toward the ocean, toward the open ocean. At some point, the Earth curves away from you, and you stop seeing ocean and you start seeing sky. So as that point happens, that is a perfect horizon line. It's a horizontal line that runs across. In any photograph that we take, there is a horizon line. It isn't necessarily the edge of what we can see. So right there is the edge of what we can see where the buildings meet the sky. But these are buildings, and they might be on top of a hill. But in this particular case, the horizon line kind of runs right through where all of these lines would intersect, right about there. So I'm going to go ahead and bring down a guide that will go across horizontally to tell me where that horizon line is. So I'll go ahead, and to do that, my rulers are already showing here. If you're not seeing the rulers at the top, you can go to View and check the box for rulers so that you'll see your rulers. And all I'll do is I'll click on where one of the rulers is, and I'll click and drag down, and I'm creating what's called a guide. And that horizontal line that you're seeing is that guide. When I let go of that guide, I'm setting that right at about where the horizon line would be. Generally speaking, it's about at the center of the photo. It depends on who shot the photo, but it's about at the center of the photo. So that's roughly the horizon line of this particular image. So I've established where that horizon line is. These red lines that I was just drawing, they can go away now. I don't need them. There we go. But I'm going to keep that horizon line for a reference point for a little bit later on. The next part that I'm going to look at is I'm going to think about, well, where is the light in this scene coming from? And so in this particular scene, we see some cues. There's shadows cast down on the ground, and those shadows tend to be coming from one side going slightly back in the scene, which means that the sun is on the right side behind us. So if we're looking at this scene, the sun is on the right side, but behind us here, shining down. So if we were standing here, our shadow would be cast out and to the left of this particular scene. So it's important to know that and to think about that before we go and find the person that we're going to put into the scene. So the shadow, or the sun is behind and to the right, the shadow is going to be cast down and to the left. Now let's go find a person. So you guys already cut out people last class. We're going to use those same people. Remember, though, that they were all posted on the course website. So if you want to go find some people, you can go into the Collage Images section. It's under Resources. And there'll be a bunch of people. So let me see more people here. And as I start to look at the people, I want to pay attention to what does the light look like on the various people that are there. Well, let me see. So as I start to go through these various people, like this person, for example. Okay, it's not the highest quality image, but the sun isn't shining on her from that same angle. So I want to pay attention to where that would be. So anyway, you guys have more options, and of course the website doesn't work, right? You guys just cut some people out. I've already downloaded a few, so I'm going to use one of the ones that I already downloaded. I'll go to File and then Place to bring that person in. And so let me jump back a scene here. There's my people. You know, I really would like that person that I used last class, but not here. OK, let me use these two people. So I'm going to use two people instead of one. It doesn't matter whether we're using one or two. And I'll place them into the scene. Now, I have a slight problem in that the shadows, oh no, actually they're right. So if I'm looking at these two people, right, the sun is behind and to the right. She is slightly behind him, therefore she's casting a shadow on him. Is it perfect? Not quite. The sun's probably a little bit more parallel with them than it is behind them, but it's close enough for our purposes. So I've just put these people into the scene. Do they look too big? Yeah, they do look too big. So I need to transform them to make them smaller. I haven't committed to my placement yet, so I can do this as we're placing. If not, I would go on to Edit and then choose Free Transform, which would let me adjust these people. Couple notes. One, as I start to transform them, if I don't hold down the Shift, it's going to be really easy to skew their ratio, which might not be the desired outcome. So if I hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, they're going to stay in proportion as I adjust them. So there, they're too big. How about there? Still too big. How about here? Too small. They look funny, right? So some of this is to your eye. OK, what looks right? Here's the trick. Remember we established that horizon line here? Generally speaking, the photographer shot the scene standing at eye level. So if we put the rough eye level at whatever our people are, they're going to feel like they belong in the scene. So if I put his eye level maybe slightly below his eye level, it's dependent on height a little bit. Obviously, her eye level is a little bit lower. Depends on the height of the photographer. Now they feel about right. They feel like they could be walking in the scene. What if I want them to be further into the scene? Well, if I keep their eye level at the same place and I shrink them down, they're still going to feel like they're in the scene. Do you guys see how that works? So there's a magic place where those eyes should be. And that's the biggest thing that people mess up initially when they're trying to put collage elements into a particular scene, is that they end up putting them in like this. They're too tall. So we need to make sure that they're shrunk down to the right size. And I could put them way back in the distance with the same rules applying. So you can choose how far into the scene they belong. Let me make them a little bit bigger for our purposes. I'm going to have them stand right about here. And I'll adjust their eye level to be about like that. And I'll go ahead and commit to that transform using the little check box in my ribbon here, my free transform ribbon. And now they're part of this scene. So as I look at this, I want to start labeling my layers a little bit. I had these shapes that were drawn initially because I was showing you where various lines were. I'm going to delete those so that they don't confuse us, because we're going to end up with a lot of layers today. So I have this, let's call this people walking, to be clear. I have my background layer, which is the scene, and I have the people. So the people are now into the scene, but look at their feet. So ignore the upper part of the image. Let me zoom in here a little bit. Ignore the upper part of the image and just look at their feet. Do they feel like they're walking on the ground yet? No, they're floating a little bit. So we have to find a way to get them to appear to be actually walking on the street. And the big thing that we're missing right now is that they're not casting a shadow. And if we added a shadow, we'd suddenly get some roots to the ground. So we're going to concentrate on that next piece of the puzzle, which is the shadow. So let me zoom back a little bit. I can press Control-0 to see the whole scene. And now I need to bring in that shadow component. So let me go to File and then Place once again. Now you guys remember last class I made you make the colored version, the black and white version, and the gray version. And you guys were all saying, why am I making this gray version? I know in your heads you were saying this doesn't make sense. Well, now you see why I made you make the gray version. So there's the gray version. Should be 75% gray. I'm going to go ahead and place the gray version into the scene. Now obviously it's way too big, so let's make that a little bit smaller. So I'll drop this down. I'll drop that down. I want that to line up on top of the people. I could actually change my order of my layers if I needed to, but it looks like it's reasonably close. I'll commit to it. We can see the gray on top. It's reasonably close. So I have the gray, and I have the people. Now I need to think about, well, wait, where's this shadow going to go? How do I know where it's going to go? And so this is one of those things, the more you practice with this, the easier it is to see where this shadow is going to go. I don't really need a guide. I could guess where it was going to go because I've done this a number of times. But if you don't know, if you've never cast one of these shadows before, sometimes you need a little bit of help. So I'm going to use the line tool over here. It's again in red. And I'm going to look for a point that then casts a shadow down on the ground. And so I've got a couple different points. This point here casts a shadow to there. The only problem with this is it's a little bit tall. It's a little bit high up in my scene. I'd like something a little closer. If there was a nice object here, like this person that's sitting, if I could tell what his shadow was, that would help. Actually, his knee is casting a shadow to right there, so that's not bad. See that line right there? His knee is casting a shadow to right there. We also know that this edge is casting a shadow roughly to right there. And shockingly enough, these two angles are fairly close. So I can use one of these shapes as a little bit of a guide to see where these shadows would be cast. So let me use this. Let me use shape 2. Let me use this one. I'm going to move it so that I can see where their shadows would be cast. And I'm doing it a little bit rough. I don't want it. I may end up moving them over a little bit because I don't want to be casting a shadow over this curb. We'll get to the curb later on, but I don't want to confuse you just yet. So let me move them over just a little bit. I'll go back to my people, and we'll move them over just a little bit. Yeah, more like that. Okay, so there's my line of my shadow. So now I need their shadow to go from their feet back roughly to that line. So I'm going to work with the shadow. So let's call this people walking shadow. Or let's just do PW. PW shadow. So there's their shadow. And I need that to lay down over here. I'm going to use something in the transform tools. So I'll go to Edit and then Transform. I'm not doing free transform this time. I'm going to transform, and I'm going to do skew. So Edit, Transform, and then skew. I am on the shadow layer. And now what I'll do with the skew is the skew allows me to edit just a corner at a time of my drawing, or of my shadow. So I'll pull that over, and I'll pull this over. So already I'm starting to skew that down. I want these to lay down a little bit more. I'll skew it down on either side. This takes practice. I will make it look much easier than it will be when you do it in yourself. And I'll keep working down the sides. Okay, so I'm starting to get there. Needs to go over a little bit more. This needs to go over a little bit more. It's a little bit shorter. That gets a little bit shorter. I need to work on this other end, though. So I've laid down the shadows, but I need to work on this end because their feet should match up a bit. So let me press Control plus to zoom in a bit. And now I need to adjust the skew on their feet just a bit. It's a little bit more challenging because her foot is slightly off the ground, so there's going to be a little bit of a gap there. His feet, we need to work on them just a bit more. Right at about there. Her shoe should have a little bit more of a gap. Let's pull that down a little bit. Yeah, it should be right about like that. So obviously the shadows are in front of my object, so we need to flip that and get them behind it. I need to double check the head over here. It needs to be a little bit longer, I think. It's right at about like that. So this is not something that you could just draw, right? I couldn't come in here and just draw what their shadows would look like. That's why we're using the silhouette, because we still get the general shape. It's just skewed and laid flat. So I'm going to commit to that because it's roughly in the right spot. I'm going to get rid of that guideline, so we don't have that guideline anymore. Actually, I'll just go ahead and delete those two because I don't need them. And now I have the shadow with the people walking. Now, the shadow goes on top of the people, so we need to change the order in the layer stack. So I'm going to put the people walking on top of the shadow, which is good, because obviously the shadow would be cast on the other side of the people. Now, as I look at this shadow, it's a little bit solid, right? I look at the shadow over here, and I can still see what's happening. So I can still see the white line. So I'm going to take these shadows, and I'm going to transform them using a blending mode. And I'll use the multiply blending mode. So I'll take on the shadow, here's my shadow, I'll go into my blending modes, and I'll use multiply. And suddenly, the shadows start to become more like shadows. I can see the white line going through the shadows. They're too dark, certainly, compared to the existing shadows. So let me take the shadow and change the opacity until it starts to feel more in line with these shadows. So that seems pretty good. Is there another problem with these shadows, though? They're the wrong color, aren't they? So the shadows in this scene are kind of a bluish tint, and these shadows are a neutral gray tint. They have no tint at all. So I need to put an adjustment layer on these shadows to start to make them feel like they belong in the scene. So the next piece is to go up to my layer, new adjustment layer, and I'm going to do a color balance adjustment, which is going to adjust the color of the image. And I'll say, OK, there's my color balance. Now, if I were to adjust the color balance right now, let's say I wanted it to be more blue, it changes the whole image. That's a problem. I only want it to change the shadow. So I'm going to tie this color balance just to the shadow layer. And I can do that using a key command. And that key command is Control, Alt, and G. So with the color balance layer selected, I'll press Control, Alt, and G on the keyboard. And you'll see that this little arrow right here appears on the layer, which means that this adjustment layer is tied directly to the layer below it, not to the other layers. So if I were to change the color balance in the image, I'm trying to do it more extreme, you can see that it's changing just the shadow, not the rest of the image. So let's put this back, because I don't want to adjust that one. Put that one back to 0. I'm going to adjust it to be a little bit more blue. So I'll skew the blue color out a little bit. And I need to visually look at what looks about right. So it's about there, I'd say. This looking the same as that. So the color now is starting to match up. That's good. It's still a little bit dark after I did that adjustment. So I probably need to go back to the shadow and adjust that opacity just a little bit more. Yep, that looks about right. So you can see I'm starting to make that shadow match up to the scene a lot more. Now, if I look at the shadows closely, this looks pretty sharp along the edge. This looks like it has a nice little blur to it. So I'd like to take it a step farther and blur out that shadow just a bit. So with the shadow selected, I'm going to go up to my filter. I'm going to go to blur, and I'm going to go to a Gaussian blur. So that's filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And I'll adjust my radius just a bit depending on what the scene looks like. And so I've zoomed in so I can see the existing shadow compared to my new shadow. And I'll adjust this value accordingly. So 0.5, for example, is probably not quite enough. 2, for example, might be too much. And so somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.9, 1, somewhere in that is about the same. So if I look at this shadow, the edges look very similar to this shadow. See how I'm trying to match those? So a lot of this integration has to do with how does your object compare to the scene. So how are we making this match up? How are we making the shadows match up? Okay, so now I have their shadow is in the scene. I'm happy that their shadow's in the scene. They're still a little bit bright. They're the most saturated object in the scene. So I probably should tone them down just a little bit. So let me do a hue and saturation adjustment on the people themselves. So I'll go into my layer, new adjustment layer, and I'll do a hue and saturation. And I'm going to drop their saturation. But I don't want to do it for the whole scene, so once again I'll press Control-Alt-G to tie the hue and saturation just to the people. Control-Alt-G, I get that little arrow. And now I could adjust their saturation down. Not quite that much. Yeah, it's probably right about there. So a lot of this is visual. OK, so now I have the people in the scene. The shadows feel a little bit too skewed that way. I'm going to skew them just a little bit more. Well, I already have the blur applied. My gut reaction is that my shadows are slightly off. I think they should be a little bit more horizontal in here. This is similar. Well, yeah, just a little bit more. Anyway, so I have those people in the scene. They feel pretty integrated. Let me go ahead and try putting somebody else in the scene. So I'll go once again to File and then Place. And I'm going to drop this girl into the scene. So there she is. Obviously, I need her to fit into the scene, so I'll shrink her eye level to be roughly at eye level of my horizon line. And I'll shrink her back just a little bit, like that. So let's say that she's placed there, and I'm happy with that. Is there anything wrong with her? OK. The lighting is not right. So she has a shadow on this side of her, and the sun is on this side of her. So she doesn't belong in the scene correctly, because the sun would be coming from the opposite side for her. So I need to change her so that she's walking the other direction. So I'll go up to my Edit, and I'll go to Transform, and I'm going to do a flip. I think it's a flip horizontal. I always forget which one's which, so I'll try flip horizontal and see. There we go. And now the sun is on the back side of her. That's good. And the shadow's on this side of her. That's good. So it's all about observation and looking carefully. Her size is OK. She feels like she's floating a little bit because she doesn't have a shadow yet, but that's OK. Let's go ahead and start to add that shadow. Let me go ahead. I think she's probably a little bit shorter than him, so I probably should move her down just a little bit. She's probably more in line with her height. So there's these kinds of adjustments. So you always have to pay a little bit of attention. OK, so now let's put her shadow in. I'll go to File and then Place. And there's her shadow. The shadow's backwards, so I'll go into my Edit and then Transform, Flip Horizontal. And we'll drop the shadow size down. A little bit bigger. Yeah, right about like that. And I'll go ahead and commit to it. There it is. So now I have her shadow, and I have her lined up. Next thing is to skew that shadow over. So let me adjust my layers here just a little bit. I'm going to take the woman and put her at the very top of the layer stack. There we go. And I lost my color balance, Control-Alt-G. Now it's tied back to the shadow. My adjustment layer had applied to the whole layer instead of being tied to the shadow when I moved those. OK, so now that's in the right spot. I'm up here. Let me rename these layers. You see that I emphasize naming the layers because you can see that I'm starting to stack up a bunch of layers. So let's organize that a little bit more. So this would be the, I'll call it walking shadow, and I'll call this walking. Just for clarity. It doesn't matter what you name them. I'm just trying to be clear. So now it's time to go in and skew that shadow. So I'll select the shadow from my layer stack, and I'll go up to Edit and then Transform, Skew. And once again, I'll start to work her shadow the same way, oops, the same way that I worked the couple shadow. this working with the shadow is going to be the hardest part today, is learning this part of the process. Remember, I have to adjust this bottom just a bit. It's not bad. Let's lengthen that out just a little bit more. OK, so let's say that that's about right for the shadow. I'll go ahead and commit to it with my check box. There it is. I need to change the layers so that the picture of the lady walking is on top of the shadow. There it is. There's a little bit of a gap because her foot's off the ground. That's the way it should be. Looks like I need to move the shadow over just a little bit. I'm just going to use the arrow keys to move that shadow over so that it's completely behind her foot, right about there. So now I have that shadow in the scene. That's good. I need to adjust on the shadow. I need to change that to a multiply. There it is. I need to adjust the opacity so that it feels about right. I need to adjust the color, so I'm repeating this whole process. So I'll go into my layer, new adjustment layer, and it's going to be a color balance. I'm going to tie the color balance to the shadow. Control-Alt-G on the keyboard lets me do that. And then I'll skew that to be a little bit more blue until it matches up. I may need to also adjust the opacity down just a little bit more. OK, so now that's there. Gaussian blur. I'm going through these steps a little faster because I went through them slower because I'm repeating myself. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. My guess is the same value would work just fine. I'll go ahead and say OK, and there we go. Anything wrong with this shadow, though? There's a curb. There's a curb. So I haven't compensated for the curb yet. So this shadow wouldn't work in the scene because, like the, let me turn her off. Of course, when I did this, I covered this up. Okay, but see how this shadow is cast by the light pole here, comes down, goes up, goes around the curve, and then continues on the flat plane. I need to do the same thing with this shadow. So I'm going to leave her off for just a second so that I can concentrate on what the shadow looks like here. Let me zoom in, Control+. Hold down spacebar to pan so that I can look and see just, let me zoom out one level. There we go. So I can see the shadow and that shadow. I need to compensate for the curb, and I'll do that doing two things. One, in order to do this edit, I'm going to need to take the referenced file. The shadow currently is a referenced file. It's a smart object. I need to actually put it into the scene. So I'm going to, on this shadow layer, I'm going to right-click on the layer and say Rasterize Layer. That will take it away from being a smart object and drop it into the scene permanently. So it's no longer a reference file. It's dropped into the scene perfectly. Now I'll use my selection tool. It's right here, this lasso tool. But I like the one underneath that's the polygonal lasso. And this just gives me a straight line rather than the regular lasso tool. I can draw a circle around my object, something like that, and it'll make a selection. If I use the polygonal lasso, however, I can control how I cut through the object. So I'm looking for a selection right at the bottom of that curb. And then I'll just come around and select the rest of the object like that. When I connect the two ends, my cursor changes to have a little circle next to it, which allows me to make this little marching ants selection. If I then choose the Move tool, you'll see that as I move the Move tool over this selection, I get a little scissors next to my arrow. That means that when I move this, it's going to actually cut it apart from everything else and move it. So let me go ahead and move that, and you can see that there it is. There's the upper part of the shadow. If I hold down Shift, it will keep everything in a line for me, and I'll move that until it comes up on the curb, about like that. Now in reality, we lose some of the shadow on the vertical. And in this scene, I didn't compensate for that. But it's a little bit too hard to figure out how to rotate part of the shadow. You could do it, but it's a little bit too much work. So I'm just going to fill in. The shadow's going to be a little bit longer than it otherwise would be, but nobody's going to notice. So I have the shadow there at the top of the curve. I now need to draw in a selection that matches how the shadow goes over the curve here. So once again, I'll use the polygonal lasso. I probably need to zoom in a little bit more as I do this. And I'm going to start, well, I'll start down here at the bottom, and I'll work my way up. Looks like it goes straight up. I can hold down Shift to make sure it's straight until it hits that point. Comes over just a little bit, back over, angles out, and then back over. I'll come across, and I'm going to mimic that same little pattern here. And then come right down to my shadow and connect the two pieces. There we go. That makes my little selection. The idea here is that the edges of the curve there match the edges of the curve here. So I'm just trying to be consistent. OK, so now I need to fill in this part of the shadow. So while I'm on this shadow layer, I'll use my paintbrush. But if I were to just paint this, yes, I know I told you to make the color of the shadow 50% or 75% gray. I didn't make this person, so I don't know for sure that it's 75% gray. So I'll actually use my eyedropper tool to sample the color. And we'll see. Well, it doesn't look like it was the 75% gray. So I'll sample the tool, or sample the color using the eyedropper. If you don't see the eyedropper, you might see one of these other tools. It's the 5th tool down. It lets you pick the color. I have to make sure that I'm on the shadow layer when I pick that color. And then we'll go ahead and we'll use my paintbrush and we'll paint that in. And now, assuming that that the color matches, it should look like a seamless little shadow. The only difference is this didn't have the Gaussian blur applied to it. So I really should add that Gaussian blur to the whole thing. Actually, I probably should have done the whole thing without the Gaussian blur and then done the Gaussian blur at the end. But I would go in once again to filter and then, oh, by the way, when you use the filters, if you come straight down, you'll see the same filter that you used last time. If you click on it, it applies exactly the same setting, so you have no fine-tuning control. So I always go back and actually initiate a new Gaussian blur. That looks about right. There we go. And it blurs out the edges for me. So now if I zoom back, Control 0, and I turn the woman back on, right, there she is, and there's her shadow being cast, and it wraps up over the curve. So again, I'm paying attention to what's happening in the scene and making sure that that's allowing the person to actually feel like they're integral to the scene. I may have to adjust her hue and saturation a little bit too. Her hair might be a little bit bright for the color of this. So I can go in once again to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I can do a hue and saturation adjustment. Control-Alt-G ties it just to the woman. And then I can adjust that saturation down just a little bit so that she feels like she belongs in the scene. So that's the streetscape scene, which you'll be doing. You don't have to put 2 people in. You can just put 1 person in. That's OK. This is all about practice. It's about learning the skills of getting the person into the scene. Next one that I'm going to do, let me do a save as on this one. There we go. Now I can close that and open a new one. So I'll go to File and then Open. Oh, and this time I was going to use that new image. I was going to use this one. So let me go ahead and download. Let's get the full resolution version of it. Starting its download. Give it a second. go ahead and show it in its folder. There it is. I'm going to copy this one, and I'll put it into my OneDrive, into today's folder. Go ahead and paste that in. And I will right-click and say Open with Photoshop. Okay, so there's this scene. So just like I started out with the street scene, I want to spend some time analyzing what's happening in this particular scene. So last time, if I were standing in this scene, the sun was coming from behind me and to the right. This time, based on this shadow, the sun is coming from behind me and to the left. So it's the opposite of what I had last time. Furthermore, if I started to think about where the horizon line was, this is always a little bit harder than a city street, because generally landscapes have hills and they roll. So we have to pay a little bit more attention. The horizon line is probably a little bit, this is a downslope, so it's probably a little bit higher than you would think. The trees, you know, if I thought about where a person would be standing, that's probably a little bit low. So my guess is because of the hill, we're going to be a little bit high. So I'll deal with that. I could drop that line in. I'm guessing it's going to be right about there or so, a little bit higher because we're looking downslope. Now I need to bring the person into the scene. I'll go to File and then Place. And let me try her and see if she'll work into the scene. Okay, she's got a little bit of a shadow being cast there, so it probably works. So I'm looking at her based on that. Okay, sounds pretty good. Let's transform her down. So I need her size to get a little bit smaller. Eye level roughly at the horizon line. I want her right about there, walking in the scene. Sometimes if you're not sure of the horizon line and you want to double check, start making her a little bit bigger and decide, does that feel just too big? So in that case, that feels a little bit too big to me. She would be a little bit too tall. Somewhere more about like that feels about right. This felt where I thought the horizon line just a little bit too small. So it takes a little bit of finesse. Just because you think the horizon line is there doesn't mean that you shouldn't double check and make some adjustments. So I'm going to say that that's where it is. I could actually go back in with the Move tool. Let me place her, and I could move the horizon line up just so that it eliminates some confusion there. Okay, so now, once again, as I look at this person in the scene, oops, I have a problem with the feet, right? She's floating on top of the grass. I need her to feel like she's part of the grass. So I need to essentially make her feet be integral to the grass. So the easiest way of doing that is to make a little bit of a copy of the background. So I'm going to take my rectangular marquee tool. I'm going to select an area around her feet, something like that. I'm going to copy that area. So I'll go to Edit and then Copy, and I'll go to Edit and then Paste. And you say, wait a minute, nothing happened. Well, actually something did happen. Let me turn her off, and let me turn the background off. And you see that I copied that piece of grass, and it looks like I didn't make the copy because it's in exactly the same place as where I copied it from. But now, if I turn the background off and I turn the person on, I could actually cut out this little piece of grass for her feet. So let me go into my Magic Wand tool. I'll select outside of her. Oops, let me be on her. I'll select the outside, so I get that marching ants. I'll go to Select and then Inverse. I'll move myself onto just this layer, and I'll press Delete. And so I've cut out for her feet where that grass would be. So I can turn her back on, and it looks essentially the same. Nothing much has changed. The difference here is I can now use the clone stamp. So remember the clone stamp from last class? I talked a little bit about it, even though I wasn't very good at explaining the offset, filter, and tiling textures. I can use that clone stamp. So I'm going to come over here. It's the rubber stamp looking icon. I'm going to pick it. And instead of using my basic brush, I'm going to come down in my brushes and I'm going to choose this brush number 134. It's called a grass brush. So I'll click the grass brush right here. If you mouse over this, it should say grass brush. There it is, grass. But it's 134. The 134 is the size, but it's the easiest way of finding it. And once I have that size selected, I'm going to zoom in just a bit down here on her feet. Like that. I'm going to hold down Alt because this is where I'm copying from. I'll click once, and then I'll come back, and I probably need to make the brush size a little bit smaller. Sometimes you have to actually start, there you go, doing the clone stamp to see the brush size. So it needs to be a little bit bigger, about like that. And now I'll hold, once again, sample, hold down Alt, click, that's where I'm sampling from, and now I'll copy grass over her, except that I need that layer to be on top of her. There it is. So now let me copy over, and let me copy over there. Now, this particular bit of grass is a little bit longer grass. So let me make my brush a little bit bigger, like that. I'll copy from right here, and we'll do some longer grass covering up parts of her leg and feet. So the advantage of the grass brush is it gives us those little spikes. That's what we're after. The color is coming from the clone stamp. Make this a little bit smaller and cover over that part of the foot just a little bit more. Here we go, about like that. So we're getting those spikes that are happening with the color that's helping her to feel like she's part of the scene. She's standing in the grass versus floating on top of the grass. Let me turn the background on so you can see her a little bit more. And so now she feels like she's part of the scene, even more so than the streetscape, because we've really buried her into the scene. Her feet are part of that scene. She still, however, needs the shadow. And this is probably the trickiest part of everything that I'm going to do, is we have to do the shadow for her as well. So let me go ahead and bring in that shadow. Let me call this first grass feet, so we're clear. I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll bring in that shadow. There's her shadow. There we go. I need to adjust the size, so we'll get the size down. You may find that we need to turn off the grass layer here as we adjust it. Let me commit for just a second and turn off the grass that's in front so I can get the size correct. Go back to Edit, Free Transform. And we'll get her to approximately the same size. And I'll commit. Now we need to skew that shadow down. This time the shadow's a little bit longer. We can tell by this tree. So we're going to drop the shadow down right in here. So I'll go to my Edit, Transform, and then Skew. It's going to be over to the side and down. Over a bit more, probably a little bit shorter. Remember that this shadow here is being cast by the tree, so that's really tall, so it's actually a pretty short shadow that she would need. So we'll adjust that, her shadow down a little bit shorter, get a little bit closer together. I need to make sure that the feet still match up, so let's skew that over just a bit. All right, not bad. So now I have her little shadow being cast. And I'll go ahead and say, OK. There's the shadow. Once again, I'll take the shadow. Let's call this woman shadow. And let's call this woman. Just trying to be organized. I can take the shadow, and I can make that and multiply. So now it's casting the shadow. That's good. And we can look at the color of the shadow and compare the color. The color is actually fairly close in this example. But what is the other problem? OK, I can turn the grass back on so the grass is in the front. Ignore the fact that part of the shadow is being cut out right now. Don't worry about that. But what's the problem with the shadow? It has sharp edges. And if we look at this shadow here, it definitely doesn't have sharp edges, does it? So we need to make sure that the shadow has fuzzy edges. So let me turn everything off, and we're going to look just at the shadow for a second. There's that shadow. I need to make that shadow have the grass edges on it. So this is, like I said, the trickier part of it. I'm going to start with the outside edge of the shadow, so this upper edge of the shadow. And if I use the clone stamp tool on the shadow layer, I'm going to have to rasterize the layer so that it's embedded into the object. I'll right-click and say rasterize layer. Now it's in the Photoshop file. I could hold down the Alt key on the keyboard. I could copy from the shadow, and I could start doing the grass on the upper edge of that shadow. But you see how it gets clipped really fast because my color area isn't very big. So what I'll do is, instead of copying from here, I'm going to give myself a temporary big box of gray to work with. So I'll sample this gray, and I'll paint it into this box. I'll get rid of this later on. This is just a helper for me. I'll use my rectangular marquee. I'll select off so that nothing's selected. I'll come back with my clone stamp, and I'm going to copy from, hold down Alt, the center of this gray area. Let's make the brush a little bit smaller. I'm using the bracket keys to do that. And I'm going to put a little bit of grass on the upper side of the shadow, like this. So you see how when I do it, I get some bits of grass that are extending over. Certainly when I do this lower part of the shadow. See how I get the bottoms of the grass down over here? That's not very attractive. That's okay. That's why I'm doing the upper part first. Let's continue on with this little bit. There we go. There we go. Okay. And because the grass is so tall, I might do a few little strands that are really tall. Just a couple in there. Like that. Now I'm going to take the color, this gray region, and I'm going to paint over this in white. So I'll go to white. I'll go back to my regular paintbrush, and we'll paint over that in white. Once this is white, because it's a multiply layer, it's never going to show up anyway. So it doesn't matter. I can actually leave it at this point instead of deleting it. But I'm going to go ahead and clone stamp this time. I'm going to hold down Alt to copy from the white region. Let's make this a little bit smaller. And I will copy over the front of the shadow with white. So the front edge of this shadow, whoops, see how I got that line right there? That's because I ran out of copy. So I'll reset, I'll hold down Alt, copy from deeper here, and we'll go back over that little edge. And the nice thing about grass shadows like this is you can kind of fudge them a little bit. They don't have to be as perfect. On concrete, the shadow and where the arms are and stuff matters. On grass, it's hard to tell what the shape is anyway. So it just has to be close. So now that I have this roughly the right shape, hold on Alt, just a little bit more right in there, perfect. With the grass on both sides, I can turn back on my background, and I can turn back on my grass that was in front, and now we can see the shadows cast, and if I zoom back a little bit, it feels more like this, where we're getting bits of it showing through into the grass. Maybe it needs to be, maybe the grass spikes need to be a little bit stronger. Maybe the shadow's a little bit dark. Remember, I can adjust the shadow down just a little bit so it's not quite so dark, depending on where that needs to be. Last piece would be to turn on the woman. And so here we've got a little bit of a challenge, and that is that the shadow, right, doesn't quite correspond to where her legs are because of how I did it. So her shadow matches up with where her feet are, but there's no shadow in this part on the legs. So I need to either edit that, or I can take the shadow and I can just move it up just a bit. And chances are that'll be just fine to adjust it. Just another way of working it. I could instead let me do Control Z. There we go. I could add some more shadow in here, just on the shadow layer. I could add some more gray right in there, but there's lots of ways of doing it. So let me go ahead, and I'm just going to move it up in the interest of time. It's not quite so long. It probably needs a little bit more shadow on these stalks of grass, though, on that side. So I may come in with a little bit of extra. We go on the grass feet layer, and I'll do a dodge and burn tied to that layer. So let me go to my layer, new layer, and we'll call this GF for grass feet dodge and burn. And that is an overlay filled with 50% gray. I'll say OK. Control-Alt-G will tie it directly to the feet layer. And then I could go in with burn, if I can find burn. And I could darken up that grass just a little bit more, like that. Maybe that's making it too saturated, but you're getting the idea of what I'm trying to do. I probably need a little bit more of just a straight overlay on it, okay? But I don't want you guys to sit here and watch me keep doing little things, okay? Once I have her integrated into the scene like this, I'll go ahead and save that. I have my first scene here. I'll save that. You're going to make one post today with both images in it. Okay, so one post, two images. One should be a streetscape. One should be some kind of a nature scene with grass. Trying to think what else. I think that's about it. This is a challenging one today. I'm pushing your abilities quite a bit, and that's okay. Remember, we're going to come back and we're going to revisit this a little bit later on. A lot of making this successful is understanding what the shadow should look like, and also where's the light coming from in the scene. So I've overemphasized that because that's a really critical component to really understanding where you're going. All right? So I'll turn you guys loose. You've got an hour and 40 minutes to work through those two images.